All right, so we're up and running for the recording. We're going to talk a little bit about units, focusing on 8 and 9 and getting ready for that exam with 8 and 9. Now, when we talk about exam total in terms of where we see kind of a point distribution, what we very commonly see is the first three sections, the bigger competencies, and we think about genetics, cells, and chemistry. Typically, that's where we see people struggle a little bit more. On average, not everybody, but on average, people tend to do better in modules 8 and 9, which is the ecology and evolution sections. Excuse me. And that's what's reflected in the living organisms components and organisms in their environment, the last two competencies that are on your coaching report if you've looked at your pre-assessment coaching report, if you tried the objective assessment before. Same coaching formatted coaching report, all right? Now, people tend to do fairly well on these on average. It's more higher scoring. But we also know that if you add up the points, it's almost a third, if not more than a third of the exam is covered by modules and units in 8 and 9. There's lots of valuable points here. So even if this is a stronger area, perfecting your technique here and focusing on the key pieces and the kinds of questions you're going to see is really valuable, because this is where you can do well, but then if you master your technique, you can max out that line, right? Max out those questions, and that helps buffer in some of the other areas where it's maybe more of a struggle, some of the technical stuff in metabolism, for instance, or the genetics, if that's a struggle for you, or the cell division, right? Doing really well in ecology and evolution can absolutely pay off to help kind of buffer that area. And we find that less effort sometimes is required, not that there's no effort, but oftentimes it's easier to get get stronger in modules 8 and 9, in units 8 and 9, than it is it takes more effort to get, move the dial, move that needle a little bit in some of those core modules in the middle, all right? So there's value here. So what do we need to focus on? And there's going to be kind of two areas. The first one is unit 8, which is evolution, and then unit 9, which is that ecology. So like we do a lot of times, what are we going to focus on? What are the key pieces here? So let's talk about that, shall we? Give me a second here. I'm going to pull them up. It is, nope, not down there. Where have we got them here? Here we are. Yep. Okay. So, two sections, all right? Unit 8, it's about evolution, and we talk about it on two scales, okay? In a single population, how do the genetics change over time for a single population? So that's not like all the rabbits everywhere. It's like the rabbits that live right there. Not the ones that live over there. It's the ones that live right there, right? That population. How do we see the change in genetics within that population? So it's like the idea that if we have a given population of rabbits, 50% are white, 50% are black. We come back 10 generations later, and we find that there's a change in the genetics. What caused it? And then it's really very much a compare and contrast. We've talked about this a lot if you've been in my TED Talks before. How do you compare and contrast with questions that give you a scenario, and then you have to figure out which mechanism is in play? Because that's what an evolutionary or an ecology biologist does. They go and see the data. This is what the genetics of my population look like. How do I figure out what happened? What caused that change? Why did I start out with more white rabbits and now I have black rabbits? Because there's more than one thing that can cause it. So we need to focus on what are the key pieces that make it different. Okay? Now, here are the key pieces. This is when, so we're talking about this change. I actually decided that this was so I could kind of focus on it, right? How do we look at this change, particularly genetics, in a small population format? What are going to be the things that drive that change? The most popular one that we talk a little bit about, and I'm actually going to jump to it, I do it first just because we talk about it a lot, is natural selection. All right? And people oftentimes think of natural selection as survival of the fittest. It is that. But the misnomer here, what people have been missing oftentimes in their definition, is it's not just survival of the fittest individual, it's survival of traits and that the fittest version of a species going forward in time. So we're talking about the species over time that the survival of the fittest applies to, not necessarily the survival of an individual member. Here's where I'm getting at. Any question or answer that's accurate for natural selection must include some sort of not just advantage for one type of an animal or another, it has to be a reproductive advantage. Now this is specific, and this is why I would say that. Imagine this. If you, in natural selection, for instance, if you have a rabbit that comes along in a population and that, for whatever reason, he has a coloring that allows him to hide from predators better, right? He survives longer. But if that coloration makes him unattractive to the opposite sex, so he has no luck with the ladies, does that trait that allowed him to survive as an individual, does it help his species going forward or that population going forward at all? No, it does not, right? That cannot be natural selection. It has to include the ability to do more reproduction. So if we can tweak that same story, if a rabbit he has a trait change that allows him to, say, have a coloring that allows him to live longer because he can hide better, but that results in him having more rounds of mating, then that's natural selection, right? But it only counts as a definition for natural selection if it includes the reproductive advantage. The most common mistake that people make on natural selection questions is they pick the answer where somebody lives longer because they get focused on the survival aspect. But the survival they're talking about when they say survival of the fittest is the species as a whole. And in order for the species as a whole to move forward, we need things that pass on from generation to generation, and that's about reproduction. So reproduction is key to any good definition, answer, or question about natural selection. That's what you're looking for. Is the reason the black rabbits became more populous than the white rabbits because they breed better. That's natural selection. That's what you're looking for. That would be the criteria that helps us define natural selection. All right? This is in contrast to two other possibilities. One, and I'll bring this back, don't worry, is genetic drift. Genetic drift is the random events that happen to a population. So, for instance, and usually it's a random event, and it's kind of what I always think of as dumb luck. Life happens. And what happens is you have a random event that disproportionately impacts parts of the population. So, for instance, in our rabbit population, it started 50-50 white and black. There's a forest fire. And the forest fire ends up killing more of the white rabbits. Not because there was an advantage to being black or white during the forest fire. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, moving forward, you're probably going to see more black rabbits in the population, right? That wasn't because they bred better. It was because they're the ones that survived this random dumb luck event. That's a real effect. The end result is still looks like natural selection, right? More black rabbits, but it's not caused by a reproductive advantage of the black rabbits, so it's not natural selection. It's a random event that skewed the numbers. That's genetic drift. Do people see the difference between those two scenarios? This is what it's going to be asking you to do, right? It's going to either ask you to help differentiate between a situation, or they're going to say, what's true of genetic drift? And they're going to be looking for, what's the hallmark? How do I know when it's genetic drift and it's not natural selection, right? And it's because it's a singular event that is more like random, right? There was no advantage to being black or white. It killed more white rabbits than black rabbits. But that still has a genetic effect long term, right? You end up with more rabbits in your population. So the end result's the same, but the mechanism getting there is different. All right. Then there's a third possibility, gene flow. The key to gene flow is that it's more than one population. Natural selection and genetic drift happen in this group of rabbits, and nobody outside the rabbits, right? Just this group. This is different than gene flow. Gene flow is when you've got rabbit population 1 and rabbit population 2, and guys from number 2 start to go over and merge and interbreed with group number 1. So imagine this. You've got a population of rabbits that's 50-50 white and black. That's where we started with, right? Now a second population. This population is almost entirely black rabbits. If this population starts to have individuals that migrate and interbreed with the second population, does this second population still say 50-50 black and white, or does it change? And if so, what becomes more frequent, black or white? What do you think? It will change. And if this influencing population is mostly black, and coming into this one it's 50-50, what will this one start to become? Which one will become more populous? Will you get more black or more white? Exactly. That looks exactly like what happened during natural selection, or exactly what happened during genetic drift, but a totally different third mechanism, right? It's not that in this single population, black rabbits breed better than white rabbits. That's not what's happening. That's natural selection. It's not that this was a single population and a forest fire killed a bunch of the white rabbits that were on this half, so you're left with mostly black, and you end up with more black rabbits going forward. That's genetic drift. This is a second population that's influencing the first. Totally new mechanism. So when you have more than one population, that's gene flow. 3 different mechanisms all lead to the same result. 50-50 black population going forward, it's almost entirely black by the end. Totally different mechanisms, all the same real genetic distribution result. That's what they're asking you to talk about and think about and dissect questions about in the microevolution component. All right? This is where the rubber meets the road. All right. The last one that we ever see is mutation. All right? Mutation is the wild card. It's something totally new shows up. So that's, and it usually sticks out like a sore thumb, okay? So this is the old thing where it's black and white, and instead of coming back and it's 80% black and 20% white, right? Instead, now it's 80% black, 15% white, and 5% speckled. Where the heck did that come from, right? It's the true wild card that comes out of nowhere, something brand new. That is mutation. Mutation is something totally off the wall, usually something really different that shows up. All right, so that's the hallmark of a mutation component. Now, all these interact together, right? Because you don't know, because you probably can have a combination, right? So what happens is you get mutation that brings about the speckled rabbit in this population, and then natural selection shows that the speckled rabbits breed better than the other rabbits. So now you've got the double whammy, right? The combination mutation and natural selection will end up leading to a population that over time will go from being black and white to almost entirely speckled. And that's what we get. We get the balance of all these 3 things happening at once. But genetic drift could take place, right? Maybe a tree falls on the few speckled rabbits that were there even though they bred better. Well, now they're wiped out and we don't see any more speckled rabbits, right? So all of these mechanisms are happening at the same time. And so you got to look at the story they present and figure out what are the impactful pieces here. Is there a reproductive advantage? Is it a random event that's making this distribution the way it is? Is it the difference between multiple populations having an input, or is it something really random that's appearing out of nowhere? And that's mutation, all right? So those are the stories you're kind of looking at and dissecting. Does that help a little bit? Feel like that sorts out some of those pieces? All right, and we'll definitely see a couple of those. The other half, so this is you're already almost done with Unit 8, right? The other big piece, it's macroevolution. And macroevolution is entirely about cladograms for the vast majority, right? It shows the image. So let's grab a visual. So I'm going to talk really briefly about a visual. So let me grab give me a second here. And I'm just going to grab one off the internet here because there's a million of them. And we'll talk about, okay, here's one. All right. So let's talk about cladograms, shall we? All right, here we go. And I'm going to make this bigger. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to see if I can bump. All right, here we go. We got about as big as we possibly can. Here we go. All right. So hopefully you're seeing this. Now, all of the cladogram questions they're going to have these pictures where you got this animal, right, these organisms. And the key here is this bottom line. this bottom line, it might not be in this exact direction, but it always starts low and goes high. It could go to the left. It doesn't most of the time. Most of the time it goes from bottom left to top right. This main line, though, that's going from the bottom and moving upwards, that is time going forward. And the idea is that this main line is a group of organisms that are all developing different characteristics as you move through time. And every now and then, parts of that population are splitting off and becoming their own species. And then what they like to talk about is it tells us, by looking at this, it tells us when different traits were acquired relative to when these different species went their own way. So that all of the questions they ask you end up coming down to a basic idea. If I take any organism, so say the salamander, I go to its branch point from where it left the main line. Any of the traits below the branch point, if it's below, these are things they have because they were part of the main group when they developed jaws and lungs, and then they left. That means they do not have claws or nails, feathers, fur, or mammary glands. Anything above the branch point, they do not have. Below, you've got. Above, you do not have. And that's true for all of them. The first kind of question you're going to get is they'll give you a picture like this, and then they'll give you a bunch of which of the statements is true. And they're going to give you logic problems. And they'll say, is it true that the salamander has lungs and does not have claws and nails? That's true, because the lungs are below and the claws and nails are above. We're using the base logic. Is it true that only the mouse and the chimp have fur and mammary glands? That's true, because they're the only two that are above that trait. So it's going to be logic, right? You got to go through each question, each answers, and figure out, is it true based on if things are above and below them? And it's all going to be just positioning. It's a logic problem, right? And so you're going to have to go through, is it true to say that this is true about these different organisms, or both of them, or one of them, or whatever, right? So that's the first kind of question you're going to get. And it's all based on if it's below their branch point, they have it. If it's above their branch point, they don't have it. Simple as that. And so that's, let's see here. Yep, cladogram, below have, above equals do not have, right? And it's all going to be based on that, right? Now, the other couple of questions they love is they want to say, what's the common thing between two organisms that are on this chart? So in that case, what they'll do is they'll say like the mouse, and then they'll choose something else, the salamander. The mouse and the salamander, what do they have in common? And they could phrase this in two ways. What they always usually phrase it as is, what's the most recent common trait that they both have, right? And what they have in common, you're correct, Maureen, is they would have jaws and lungs in common. And if they were asking for the most recent, it would be what you do is you go to the one that's lower on the split, right? So that would be the salamander, and you look right below that. That's the most recent. The last thing they both acquired when they were related directly in the same group was lungs. So lungs would be the most recent trait that both salamanders and mice have in common. The most recent, because it's farthest up the tree, going forward in time, the last thing that one of those two animals got before it left. The other version of this question is where is the common ancestor? On the line where physically is the organism that's the last time that they were the same thing, that basically there was an organism that became both of them, right? That over time went to become the salamander and the mouse. When were the last time were they together? And the last time they were physically together, when you look at the actual ancestor, they're not talking about a trait, they're talking about the ancestor, the physical organism, that's going to be right at this branch point of where the salamander splits off. Because right below, right, so it's not going to be the perch, because the perch is off the line. The perch is something totally different, right? The perch isn't a common ancestor of either of these things, right? If it was either of these things, this perch would split up here and become the salamander or the mouse farther on the perch line, but that's not what happens. The perch left the main group before the salamander or the mouse did. So the common ancestor for the salamander and the mouse is a physical location. It's right here at the branch point of the salamander, because right as the salamander leaves the group, this is where that organism lived in the main population, and then right after this point, it went over to become a salamander, and then the rest of them went over, and eventually some of them became a mouse. But when they had them in common, when they both were the same organism, there was only one that became two, is right here before the salamander left. It's physically at the branch point. So the kinds of questions you'll get here is what's common about two of them, and they're going to be looking for what's just below or the branch point of the lower. That's where the actual ancestor sits, and then the trait is the most common. This is the most recent common trait. So you're always going to go, but in either case, when you're looking for the most recent common, you go to the person that's lower and look down below them, down near where they branched off. That's where that answer should be. All right? The other one they like to do, the final one, so there's three flavors of questions. The other one is who's most closely related? And it's a balance between the two factors. One, how much do they have in common? The more they have in common, the more closely they're related. The second item is how many things do they have that are different? The more that's different, the less related they are, right? So you want a pair of animals, if you're looking for the most ones that have the most in common, that are the closest related, they should have very few differences and a lot of similarities, right? So what does that look like on the chart? To have few differences means you're close together. So like the salamander and the lizard only have one thing in between them. That means there's only one difference. But the salamander and the chimp have two things that are different between them, right? So there's more that's different between the salamander and the chimp versus the salamander and the lizard, right? So there's less in between. We want few things to be in between, so we want them to be close together. The other thing is we want lots of things to be below both of them. So the salamander and the lizard are a pretty good pair because there's only one thing that they don't share, right, that's in between them, while they have two things that they share. So there's more in common than different, versus the salamander and the chimp have two things that are different and two things that are the same. Less common, right? Less balance there, right? It's more even. They have the same number of commonalities as they do differences. That's why we could clearly say the salamander and the lizard are more closely related than the salamander and the chimp. Aha! The mouse and the chimp are an awesome example because they have nothing that we can see or that's different about them outside of the fact that they're on different points of the chart, right? They have no listed differences, and they've got four things in common. On this chart, without question, the most related pair is the mouse and the chimp. You're exactly right. So what you're looking for are things that are close together and usually shifted up to the right, because that means there's going to be a lot of stuff below them, right, that they have in common. So things that are up to the right and close together typically are the most common, they are the most related. But it doesn't have to be that way. Right? It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, because you could compare the perch and the salamander and the chimp, and the perch and the salamander are actually more closely related because they are one-to-one, right? Only one difference, one similarity. These guys, you know, they're farther apart. They've got 2 and 2, so it's just basically not quite the same, right? Then it's actually these guys, it'd be a toss-up, right? And so it really depends on, and in fact, there's probably more differences along this line than we're not seeing. So I would almost suggest that the perch and the salamander are probably closer than the salamander and the chimp because there's actually more things that are different along this span of the line. Right? So even though they have a few things in common, they've got lots of gaps here. Versus these guys have one thing that's different, but they're pretty close together. So that's a value, right? They don't have many things that are different about them. So the closer they get together, the stronger that connection becomes. So those are the key types of things you're going to have to answer. And it's all predicated, right? All the logic that I use for all these questions is all based, yes, the mouse and the chimp are definitely most closely related because these guys are way at the top, almost nothing different about them relative to this chart, and a whole bunch of things they have in common, right? So they're super related. So, but all this stuff I'm doing, right, all these logic questions are all based on the same idea, that everything below your branch point are things you got, and everything above are things you don't got, right? I'm just putting them all together and thinking about it in chains, but it's still the same. It's all based on that basic understanding. So as long as you focus on that, you can start to work your way to lots of different kinds of answers just following the logic chain. All right. So hopefully that helps a little bit. And definitely, yes, most of the time, if they look at for a specific ancestor, they should have like a circle or an arrow that's pointing at the branch spot, right? You're going to be able to identify. If they're looking for the common ancestor, not the trait, right, the actual organism, it's going to be physically on that line somewhere. And usually they'll either put an arrow or a dot right on that branch spot. And there's actually a question like this on the pre-assessment. It's one of the ones where it's the, I can't even remember the animals. It's the gorilla and the wolf and how they're different from the frog. And the frogs, they literally looks like here. It's like, this is like the gorilla and this is the wolf and the frog's right here. And they have the differences going between them, and they mark the spot between them, but they also mark the branch point. And the answer to the common ancestor that's common to the wolf and the gorilla and excludes the frog, right? So it's past the frog, but includes the wolf and the gorilla is right at the branch point for the wolf, which is the lower one. This is one of the questions that's on your pre-assessment if you want to go back and review questions on pre-assessment. I guarantee, I'm almost positive that's the wording. Something almost really close to that, okay? And this is exactly what it is, and and they use letters, and I think they use a letter that basically has a dot right at the branch spot for the wolf is basically the right answer. It's like the letter C, which is the branch spot. Something like that. Yep, there you go. All right. All right. So there you go. There is really the fundamental pieces. Yep, these are the two things that the vast majority of the questions that come from Unit 8 are about. There's a few other ones. The other ones we talk a little bit about it all. There's a little thing about the other two definitions for some of the selections we talk about that ever come up are artificial selection. That's when the pairings of who's breeding right are being done very intentional that don't have to do with the fact that it's going to help them survive long term. It's usually this is what man does a lot, right, because we want them to look a certain way or produce more milk or whatever. It's not to help them survive better, right? It's for different purposes. That's artificial selection. When we're forcing the fit, when it doesn't follow natural selection law, and then we're forcing the fit in terms of breeding patterns to try to derive some specific thing that we want at the end. That's artificial selection, or artificial breeding. And the other one is sometimes they talk, I think, a little bit about sexual selection. Sexual selection is one of the pressures that goes with natural selection. Sexual selection is what makes a mate desirable, right? What is the criteria that a mate of a given species is going to use to pick who it wants to have kids with? And that's the selective process, right? And so they go hand in hand with natural selection lots of time. So if they talk about what's driving a population or potentially driving the change over time in a population, and it's based on the mating habits, right, who's attracted to who, that would be sexual selection. All right, that's a version of natural selection that's specific to the mating component of who gets to reproduce, right? Because it still comes back to the big definition of natural selection, which is more reproduction. And in that case, the linchpin for more reproduction is to be attracted to the opposite sex. So that it's a finer level definition of one of the mechanisms in play for some kinds of natural selection, which is sexual selection. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. Big lots of stuff for Module 8, right? That gives us to Module 9. Module 9, I keep saying module. That's not what I mean to say. I mean to say Unit 9. Unit 9 is ecology, and again, we can break it down into two major pieces, and we can hit both of them pretty straightforward, okay? I'm going to bring up my notes first. Well, I should be able to do some visuals as well. It's not terrible, okay? Two things you need to be able to do. Once again, break down into two things. One, there's going to be questions that basically focus on your ability to differentiate, we've talked about this a lot, right? Compare and contrast between population, community, ecosystem. What you're looking for, here's the hallmarks you got to know. Population, it's a single species in a given location. Not everywhere, it's the rabbits that live there. And you know it's a species because they interbreed, right? A population, a single population in a given location. Not the one on the other side of the mountain, the one on this side, right? That's a population. Okay? We go to a community when we're still in a given location. Let me start to break this down just a little bit. Again, I want to kind of chunk through it so you can kind of focus on what I'm looking at. It's multiple species, single location. Now we add species. Now, here's the most common problem that people have, and it breaks my biology heart a little bit that people struggle with this, but it's true. It just is. People forget the non-animals. Anything living is a species, folks. So a classic example, I know this is on the pre-assessment, and I think it's on one of the, I can't remember, it's the unit quiz or one of the other ones. There's one about woodpeckers that live in like the western forests, and they talk about the woodpeckers and their favorite tree. And everybody says population because all they're looking about is the woodpecker. What about the poor tree? That's a species. Everybody focuses on animal, animal, animal. It's living things. You've got to remember non-animals as included in your count when you decide if it's a population or a community. People make this error a ton. They don't count the bacteria. They don't count the plants. They don't count something else, right? They always want to focus on the big cuddly face. That's fine, but you're going to be in trouble if you don't focus. You don't keep that at least in your head, right? That's my biggest kind of simple error that people make fairly consistently. So you got to remember when they include that, this is what they're looking at. And the final one is an ecosystem. Multiple species, given area, and here's the key. How do I know it's an ecosystem and not a community? It's this last piece. I start to add the abiotic, the non-living. So as soon as I start to talk about things are living, but I also start to talk about ambient temperature, rainfall, soil content, mineral content, sunlight duration, seasonal stuff, humidity, elevation, you get the picture, right? All the non-living components that make an ecosystem unique, it's the abiotic, the non-living. As soon as the non-living is part of the system that we're talking about, you've jumped from community to ecosystem. That's the criteria you're looking for. Now, you're going to do the exact same thing as these other questions. They're going to give you a situation. You got to figure out what level they're talking about. They like to do this in multiple ways. They either give you a general scenario and you figure out right off the bat, is that a community, a population, or an ecosystem? Or they ask you a question about what of the following is true about an ecosystem, a community, or a population, and they're going to have answers, some of which are true for population, some of which are true for communities, right? They're going to have to pick and choose. Same idea. That's still just straight compare and contrast. The third kind that they love to throw, they do the experiment. Here they describe an ecosystem. Here are the pieces of the ecosystem, and here's where they get people. Then they ask, here's what the scientist is studying within the ecosystem. Here are the pieces that are part of the study. Now, what level is the study happening at? Not the ecosystem they described, but the study within that ecosystem. That's the one where people mess up. Because you got to look at specifically, well, what aspects are they using? So, for instance, they talk about a lake. That's a cold water lake, and there's a fish that eats a certain kind of plant life, right? If they're doing, that's the ecosystem. They describe all those pieces. But then they say, well, I'm going to do a study about the fish. That's a population study within that ecosystem. I'm going to do a study about the fish and the algae they eat. That's now a community study. They're talking about multiple living species. It's a community study. Now I'm going to study looking at the fish and the algae they eat as it's affected by water temperature and barometric pressure. That's abiotic. Now you're doing an ecosystem level study because you've included multiple species and an abiotic non-living component. Hopefully that highlights that difference, right? People miss that difference between those things all the time, and they miss the way it's phrased, right? They keep focusing on what is being described and not what's being studied within the backdrop that they've described. You've got to look at the specifics of the question. What parts are they really looking at among the listed items? And what criteria on this sheet does it fit? At what level does it ring true? Okay, that's how you're going to look, and that's lots of the questions. They frame them all different ways, but guaranteed, most of them, the majority of them, are coming back to this. Knowing these definitions is either going to allow you to pick out the right answer, or, oftentimes more importantly, eliminate answers that can't be right. Right? I'm not sure what the answer is, but I know it's not ecosystem because I'm not talking about anything non-living. I can cross that answer out, right? You get closer to the answer. You know, you got to always put things in your favor. You eliminate the odds, right? Massage that question. All right. I'm going to go to this. I'm going to bring out the last piece, but yes, focus. That's a huge piece about almost all the questions they phrase here, right, in terms of how people miss questions on this exam. You have to really dig. What exactly does this question want to know? Specifically, what do they want to know? Do they want to know about that ecosystem, or do they want to know what it's like when I study the fish in that ecosystem? That's a different question, right? You got to look at the specificity of the question. You have to read the questions. You're exactly right. Half of this exam is attention to detail and being a focused, engaged test taker. All right, which leads us to the last piece. Look at us, got a nice time here for the last piece. So you're going to get some food web questions, right? You're going to see the food web. And this one is very much more about those definitions, about where things fit. And it's two things that you can kind of think about when it comes to these things. You can think about, what does it mean to be sitting at the different levels, right? So you have to be able to maybe identify producers and consumers, those that can do photosynthesis at the base of those pyramids and the food webs, and then the consumers, everybody else who feeds up on them, right? And it goes in order as you move up the tiers, right? The primary consumers, the herbivores that only eat the plant life and the producers. You've got the secondary guys that are one removed from the producers. These are the secondary guys that sometimes eat a little bit of the plants, but mostly things that eat the plants, right? They're the second level up. These are very much the secondary consumers. They are often the omnivores, the guys that eat both, right? They'll eat a little bit of fruit when available, but also all the bugs below them. Birds are a great example. They very often sit in that secondary component because they'll eat lots of fruit and things from a tree, but they'll also eat anything they can catch. Right? So they're this omnivore. They sit in that middle frame, right? That secondary component. And then you got the guys at the top of the heap, the king of the jungle, the tertiary, third-level consumers. Those are your carnivores. That's the king of the jungle. You're talking lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, right? The wolves are at the top. And so these ones, it's very much based on that position and understanding how that tiered effect works, right? So there's going to be some questions about defining the different roles and how these guys impact each other and where they, based on where they're sitting, what are they most likely like, right? The only ones that we do not have on here, and let me actually, I was going to put these in here, is the guys that allow the circling to come back, okay? The circling to come back are the decomposers. The decomposers here are the guys that they literally feed off of decaying matter, right? And they are coming and they help break things back down and start the cycle back around. And so you often have guys that are around the corner and they kind of feed on everybody, right? Because they feed on once they're dead, right? And so the decomposers are on the other side. And the common word that you sometimes see for certain decomposers, and particularly what we consider the active decomposers, the ones that are physically eating the stuff, right? So some organisms kind of wait for it to actually kind of break down and they just kind of soak it up, right? They don't actively kind of chew on it. But there's a group of these decomposers that are more active, that actually chew stuff up. Those guys are the detritivores, and they often bring this word up. The detritivores are a version. They're really active decomposers that physically chew stuff up, right? So like you could consider lots of your scavengers are detritivores. That's a version of a decomposer. They help that decomposition. They feed off stuff that's already dead, but they're more actively going after. Vultures are a classic detritivore. Worms, to a certain extent, are a major detritivore, right? These are active things that are going after that stuff. So that's the difference versus certain bacteria and some of the fungus, they actually kind of eat it up after it's already broken down by nature. They kind of suck it up versus they actively go after it and chew it up and process it, okay? So they're really active. So this is another one they like to do. And there's detritivores that like live in the ocean, like most of the crustaceans, the crabs and the lobsters and stuff are very much the detritivores of the ocean, right? They are basically, they go out and they actually chew up the stuff that's at the bottom and the dying stuff. They actively go after it. So crabs and lots of the shellfish guys are active detritivores because they don't filter feed as much, right? They're not as passive as like a clam or, you know, some of these little guys that just kind of like plants that sit underwater. They're actually going out and crunching up stuff. So they're much more like a vulture or a worm or something that's actively eating. So it's a detritivore, but it's an aquatic detritivore. All right? Those are the big webs, right? Those are the big four. You got producers, consumers, decomposers, and then those levels within the consumers, and you're going to be able to have to kind of identify them based on a web. The other ones is some questions about interaction between them. And we have some classic stuff, right? Two guys that exist at the same level and are going after the same prey, they're in competition, whether that prey is the same kind of plant or the same, if they're both secondary and they both eat that one kind of butterfly, they're in competition, right? Those are competitors. You've got predation. Those are the guys that are on either end of that arrow, right? The guys who are eating, the guys who are eaten. Pretty straightforward. But then you also have guys that are not in competition. They're not technically at the other end of the arrow that connects them, but they're together in an ecosystem and they rely on each other. And those are the symbiotic relationships. And we have a combination, and did I not get my last? Oh, there it is. Sorry. I was like, that doesn't make sense because I don't have my last one on there. And our symbiotic relationships tend to be based on, in all those situations, the reason that it's symbiotic is because somebody's winning, right? There's a reason why it happens is because at least somebody's getting the benefit. How we define them is how the second organism is reacting to that interaction. Parasitism, this is like a tick or like a tapeworm. The parasite is in good shape. They're loving living in this relationship. The other organism, not so much. It's detrimental. So it's a plus-minus. That's a parasitism relationship. But it's not technically predation because they're not killing the host, right? They're just feeding off of it. Commensalism is where one organism gets a benefit and the other one doesn't give a rip. Couple of classic examples in the plant world. If you've ever seen those trees in the south that grow up and they've got all that moss hanging from their limbs, that moss is not actually feeding at all on the trees. They don't hurt the trees one iota. But it helps that moss a ton to be lifted up higher into the air for more gas exchange and to be up in the sunlight more because they're on the tree. So there's a huge benefit for the moss to be on the tree, and the tree doesn't care. Commensalism. Good for one, the other one doesn't care. The other classic, and it makes me laugh so I always remember it, is the dung beetle. There's that beetle in Africa that rolls around the big ball of poop, right? And it uses it for reproduction, for protection, for nutrients, all kinds of crazy stuff, right? Well, it follows the giant herds of like zebra and giraffes and elephants. It's really dependent on these massive herd animals and the amount of poop they produce to have this resource. Do you think the elephant cares what that bug's doing with its poop? No, it does not. It always makes me chuckle about it, right? But that's a classic commensalism. The dung beetle and the elephant have a classic commensalism relationship. The elephant does not care, but the beetle gets a huge benefit from hanging around with the elephant. Commensalism. Finally, mutualism. Win-win. The best example of these are almost always all the pollinators, right? And this happens in a huge range, by the way. We oftentimes think of pollinators as the insects like moths and bees and wasps and butterflies and blah, 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 right? They get the pollen from the plant. In return, they get nectar that the plant puts out for them, right? And in return, they move the pollen between plants and help with sexual reproduction. Win-win. One guy gets goodies, the other one helps with sexual reproduction and gets better fertilized offspring for better natural selection moving forward. Lots of diversity. Win-win. This also happens in mammals. We don't think about it as much, but birds and mammals, like in the rainforest, are really big on this. This is what most fruit is derived from. Fruit is a plant's way of saying, hey, look at this yummy thing to eat. The animal eats it. And what does it do? It gets a bunch of nutrients, but in the process, all those seeds from the plant go through the digestive tract of that animal and come out in its poop. What did they just do? They just prepped that seed, and they just dropped it in a bunch of fertilizer. Win-win for the plant. That's exactly what's happening with most fruit is it gets processed by animals and then dumped back out in the feces in the jungle, right? Most really tough fruit or tough, if you ever grow from your own seeds, you oftentimes have to score them, right? You have to scrape the outside of seeds. You have to prep them in water. You have to do all the stuff to get your seed ready to sprout. That's what going through the digestive tract of the animal is doing. It's prepping that seed to be really fertile and ready to sprout as soon as it's pooped out, and it's in a bunch of dung, which is basically fertilizer. The animal has moved it around and spread it around the jungle, prepped the seed, and put it in a bunch of fertilizer. How much better could you ask for if you were a plant? That is why it's providing fruit. That's why it's developed fruit in the first place. Mutualism. Win-win, people. Again, so you're going to be asked with a couple of pictures and diagrams. What's the levels? Who's who? What's their role? What's the impact if I get this guy or that guy, right? Or I'm going to talk a little bit about a given relationship between two organisms and that thing and how are they interacting? At what level of a relationship do they have? Not what do we call the level where they sit? What do we call the interaction, the dynamic component between the two organisms that are happening there? Are they competing? Is it a predation cycle? Could they have a symbiotic relationship? And if so, what it would be? These are the ones you need to know. And this right here, it's not all of it. Obviously, it's not all of it. But there's a huge chunk of the questions from the last two competencies, from Unit 9 and 8, which make up the bulk of them. This is what you need to know. These are the compares and contrasts that you need to know to have some success on those components of the final. And what we find is oftentimes getting better at these is easier than getting better or really better at metabolism, right? It's got a lot less bells and whistles. And maybe it seems less foreign. It's easier to look at. It's got more animals that you recognize, right? Some more familiar words and pictures. And so what people do is they get good at this. They max out all the questions for these, and that helps buffer all the other areas. So it's a very effective technique in maximizing what you know. More bang for your buck. All right, I'm going to stop. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm just going to get this out of the way. Let me hide that for right now. But there's the biggies, and I think that was, I'm making sure I'm not hiding anything on this one. I don't think I was. No, I'm not. I'm not hiding anything over there. All right. And that takes us right at, we still got done right about at 8 o'clock, or 8 o'clock my time, sorry, 9 o'clock Mountain Time. It could be as late as midnight, I know. Hopefully this is helping people, and thank you guys so much for hanging in there with me on a Friday, or not Friday, I'm not even seeing it's Friday, it's hump day, it's Wednesday. And thank you guys for hanging with me. I'm going to stop the recording in just a minute. If people are willing to hang around, I'll post the recording link here on the chat page, so give me a few seconds to do that. It will also be posted as a link if you're in the Trello cohort. Continue to work through that, do review. It'll be on that little that card in the main Trello page that I keep adding to with a new recording for this round to kind of keep everybody getting prepped as we head towards that finale. All right. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to turn off the audio, stop the recording now, turn off the video, but I will keep this up and running. And if I'll keep up the page up and look for this. I'm going to post in just a second here with that link if people really want to have, do additional recording and take a look at it again. You're more than welcome to do that. All right. Thanks, everybody. Yep. I hope everybody has a great night. And if anybody has a question or direct thing that needs to contact me for any reason, you can always contact me directly by email. There's mine right there. All right. But otherwise, look for the post. Have a great night, guys.